absolutely delighted and excited, Trisha, to welcome you and your panel to join us on the podium. People who need probably not too much introduction, but you got Sharon Corbett, who's Senior Manager at MBIE. You got Angus Jones, who's the Chair of the Code Working Group. Derek Grantham, who makes so many things in the FMA happen. And of course, Katrina Shanks, who's the CEO of Financial Advice New Zealand. Warm welcome to all of you. Please join us.
Morning, everybody. My God, what a huge number of people. Congratulations, well done. I listened to the Minister yesterday and I first heard him say these 3 words back in 2017, that he wants wise, informed and motivated investors, and I guess all of you feel the same as well. So my panel this morning is now a group of 4. Unfortunately, John Bottica is taking a bit of a back seat today. He's got some family illness that he's dealing with, so he is in the room, but he may have to leave at any time, so he sends his apologies. What I'd like to say to you is that this is your show today. It's about you. It's about an opportunity now over the next wee while to ask questions of the regulators. There is, as Richard said, so much going on at the industry at the moment, and there was last year. And there's an awful lot happening in that advice space, and significant advice challenges and changes coming up for all of us. But we can all work together to make it an opportunity and do the right thing by all New Zealanders and consumers. This panel we've got is a diverse panel of industry and community people, and they're leading and driving and making the changes that are happening out there at the moment. So this is your opportunity to ask them the questions. What I guess implore or ask you to think about when you're putting your hand up with a question is, I'd like to think about us in a forward-thinking, future-focused mode. We are where we're at. This is what we've got on the table, and so your questions would be great if they're around where we're at now and what the future holds. And I will ask each of the panellists as we go through what they see as success perhaps over the next year or the next 5 years. What I'm going to do in starting is I've asked each of the panellists to just give a 2-minute overview of where they think we're at, the current status. I mean, John and Derek have been spending a lot of time with advisors, advisor groups, networkers, etc. Katrina and her team have also been dealing with a lot of advisors. So perhaps if I start with you, Katrina, just current status and view from you, a couple of minutes.
Great, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. Great to see so many advisors here. So I think there are 4 levers that are in play at the moment, all at the same time, which makes it a very complicated sector at the moment. The first one is obviously the legislative change. So we've got legislation which has come in, which previously was more focused on AFAs. Now it's all advisors are in this legislation. Not only advisors, but also businesses are within this legislation. So it's much wider than it has ever been across the financial services sector. So that's the first big movement in terms of the legislative, regulative change. Then we've got commercial changes, which is the second lever. So you're seeing product providers making decisions, who, how, where products can be accessed. That's quite a big change for the sector. Commercial agreements are changing on the back of the legislative requirements. So that's quite a big change in your business as well. Then we're seeing the competency change. So there's a drive towards getting level 5 qualification, and we're seeing that through advisors making that decision through the structures that they're looking for their FAPs going forward, but also the bigger FAPs driving qualifications as well. So the competency side is changing in the sector as well. And then we've got societal change. So that's the 4th lever that's happening all at the same time. So there's an expectation out there from society that they want a value when they get a service, but also they expect a professional service and a professional business. So the expectations of society are changing at the same time as well. So if you take the legislative, commercial, competency and societal changes, there's quite a lot of expectation on advisors at this time. So if that's what it's like now and that's where we're going with all the changes, what does it look like in 5 years' time is really the question. And how are you going to be relevant in 5 years' time with all these changes which are happening at exactly the same time? So I believe what we're going to see is an increase in public confidence and trust. because you've got a much stronger framework across all advisors. So with that, you're going to see growth. You're going to see more consumers thinking about seeking financial advice because they've got more trust in the sector. What we're going to see is structural change. I think we're going to see a lot more bigger FAPs come through as the people have decided that maybe they haven't got the skills they need to meet the requirements for a FAP licence or requirements for competency. So you'll see clustering into bigger FAPs, but you'll also see other FAPs evolve as people get more competency through level 5 and have more confidence going forward. So we are going to see structural change, and we'll see some people naturally exit the market at the same time. And then on top of that is the competency side. As there is a drive to get level 5 qualifications, I think that'll become the norm, and there'll be an expectation that if you give regulated financial advice, you will have that qualification. So I think we'll see a much more educated financial services sector come through. And when you get that, you get much stronger career pathways, because everybody's got a bit of skin in the game because they've got some education which is specific to an industry and to an outcome. So I think what we'll see is much stronger career pathways through the sector, which will be fantastic because we'll have longevity, and we'll have pathways for those coming from polytech, university, school, entry back into this sector as a second or third career, and staying in the sector long, which is really positive. And then I think advice is going to be delivered quite differently. It's a relationship game as advice. That's where the value is. But I think society will want to be able to access advice online to begin with in the form of a transaction. And there'll be a point where an advisor comes into that transaction, and that's where you add the value. So if you're a transactional business now, I think you're going to have to look to how do you move to more of a value-based business, because as consumers want to do more online initially, and even that's just uploading their information initially online, then seeking that meeting with the advisor, they don't want to be filling out forms with the advisor. I think we're moving past that as society, and the real value is the relationship and the understanding that you build with your client. Overall, I think it's a really rosy future for financial services, and I think we're really ready to boom in New Zealand, and to have New Zealanders have more maturity around increasing their financial health, wealth and wellbeing.
Oh, great, thank you. Angus.
Thank you, Trisha, and good morning, everybody. Lovely to see everybody here. If there's one fundamental theme in the world of financial services, not just in New Zealand, but globally, it's this increasing focus on conduct. And if there is a single flag bearer of conduct, it is the code. And that's because financial advice is the key touch point between industry, the profession, and consumers. So what sits in the code is critical to how we evolve over the next few years what good conduct looks like. So the code takes effect, as you know, on the 29th of June, replacing the existing code. I suppose the central difference in this code is its consumer-centric focus. The customer is at the centre of every piece in the code, every single standard and all the commentary in the code. But the other important point to note about the code is this is not just the code that we've dreamt up. The legislation envisages, and we've tried to be true to the legislation, that the code is a product of detailed consultation. Most of the people in this room were involved in some way or another in our 18 months of consultation, and a big thank you to all of you for that. What you see in front of you in the code that we've got is a product of that consultation. So what does this mean for the different sets of people going into the new regime? And although you can carve that up into a number of different pieces, I'll just talk quickly about two. Firstly, authorised financial advisors who have been used to operating under a code. There shouldn't be huge surprises in operating under the new code, but I would encourage you to read it carefully with that consumer lens and to see how we've tried to shift the emphasis to put the client at the centre. For people who haven't operated under that code, and I'm thinking particularly of RFAs, I think actually the consumer-centric focus works in your favour, because my observation and what we've heard during consultation is there are an awful lot of RFAs who absolutely hold their client and their client's outcomes central to the way they conduct themselves professionally. And it's building upon that and developing some evidence and some support to show how you do it. And that's what the code is all about. So I'd encourage whichever pathway you've come from to grasp the code positively, and I hope that it works for you and I hope that it's helpful for you. Thank you.
Thanks, Angus. Sharon.
Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. By today's count, it is now 138 days until the new regime comes into effect. And I personally feel really positive about the future of financial advice in New Zealand. I think it's helpful just very briefly to kind of remember why we're here and what is this really quite significant regulatory change. And I think most people, certainly in this kind of room, agree that there are some fundamental flaws with the current regime, and the main one being the lack of a level playing field, which means that there's consumer confusion and inconsistent treatment for consumers. So really the new regime, it's all about trying to build trust and confidence, and the main way it does that is by having a level playing field so that whether I walk into a bank for financial advice, whether I talk to my KiwiSaver provider, whether I go see a mortgage broker, whatever the case, I receive those same protections. So ultimately, what we all want in this room out of this is for more New Zealanders to seek advice. And as everyone here knows, people who get advice, they're more likely both to be financially better off, but I think even more importantly, they're the ones who have greater peace of mind that they're on the right track and are making good decisions. And actually in session 3, you're going to hear some really powerful statistics and data about the value of advice, which I found really cool when I heard it yesterday. I just wanted to briefly talk about the conduct reforms. So there's a bill in Parliament at the moment that will hold banks and insurers, will also hold them to good standards of fair treatment. So really I think of it as kind of like the financial advice sector is going to be leading the way in this regard. But ultimately we want everyone in the financial sector to also be held to those standards of fair treatment, whether we're talking about financial advice or whether we're talking about the way that financial products are actually designed in the first place. We certainly recognise that there is a lot of regulatory change happening at the moment, and Richard's diagram before really highlighted that. But I think if you put all of that change together, whether we're talking about insurance contract law, the conduct reforms or the advice reforms, it's really all aimed at trying to help create a thriving financial services sector where consumers can have greater confidence that financial products will meet their needs and that they're going to be treated fairly. And so we really do hope that ultimately that's going to be a great win-win for consumers and for the sector.
Thanks, Sharon. Derek.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I think my fellow panellists have provided an excellent, thorough review. It begs the question, what more can I say at the end? But maybe just a few words of encouragement. I think that as a sector, your star is on the rise. I think this is your moment in the season. I've got 3 reasons why I believe that. And one is that I think that we're right on the cusp of a whole new era. We're about to have a whole new advice regime that delivers the building blocks to enable you to grow in trust and confidence. Trust in the quality of advice and confidence in you as advisors, and what it takes is what I've seen over the last few years as I've travelled right across the country talking to lots of advice businesses, which is really passionate and committed advisors who are up for it and up for implementing these changes, and I think that's what it's going to take. And secondly, if you look at a lot of the research, and FSC is an example of producing a whole bunch of research that talks to some of the issues such as low levels of financial literacy and the fact that only 20% of New Zealanders have a financial advisor, which speaks to a huge opportunity. It talks about how many New Zealanders are not saving enough for retirement or have no idea whether they're saving enough. In fact, many are not even contributing to KiwiSaver at all. And it's an excellent research that's really trying to scope the potential underinsurance problem. So there has to be the strongest case ever for advice is right now, right in front of you. And I think thirdly, and this is really a call out to the sector as a whole, it strikes me that really as a sector there's an opportunity. I think there's an opportunity now to grow in solidarity, to grow a stronger voice. Maybe it's a moral voice, a voice about, as a sector, what you believe to be right and what you believe to be wrong, acceptable and unacceptable, because it's the opportunity where we talk about, this is about getting in shape, but really from a sociological point of view, we are shaped by the people around us. We're shaped by the groups we belong to. And so here's an opportunity for the sector to shape itself, to shape the future, to shape future financial advisors. So I think when I look at it all and bring it all together, this is your moment, and I think your star, as I say, is on the rise. So take it and run with it.
Thanks, Derek. Quite a few points there that I want to allude to, so I'll get back to those. But Sharon, yesterday the Minister raised two elements in his presentation, and he talked about the disclosure regulations and also the review of the FMA levies and funding. Now, I saw quite a lot of people in the room yesterday shake their heads, so obviously it's, I think, two elements that perhaps can you just sort of share with us where you're at with those?
Yes, thanks. And yeah, I'm getting a lot of questions in particular about disclosure and where that's at. So we consulted at the end of last year on some draft disclosure regulations, and we got some really helpful feedback and submissions, and we had some really great conversations with the industry about how those regulations would work or wouldn't work in practice. So we're in the process now of making some minor changes to the regulations to address some of the concerns we heard, which were things like a lack of clarity about how the record keeping requirements were going to work, whether the regulations actually required advisors to repeat the same information at different points, which wouldn't have been helpful to consumers. And we also heard that there needs to be some time built in so that advisors can actually produce all of the new material and get ready for the disclosure requirements before they come into effect. So right now I'm hoping that the disclosure regulations will be released next month in March. And like I say, there will be some time built in to transition over to those new requirements. In terms of funding, so MB and the FMA are consulting right now on firstly, how much funding should the FMA have going forward, and then as a result of that, what should the various industry levies be set at? The main question I'm getting is kind of why now weren't levies for financial advice just set? But actually up until now there hasn't been an increase in the FMA's funding, including to be ready to deal with the new financial advice regime, and that's because the FMA had some reserves that they could use first. But we're now at the point where we need to ensure that the regulator is well resourced and able to well implement this new regime and also respond to other cost pressures across the FMA. Unfortunately, an increase in funding does likely mean an increase in levies, but we need to make sure we get the balance right between having a well-resourced regulator, but also so that costs aren't so great that they actually become a barrier to operating in the sector. So that's exactly what we're consulting on right now. Have we got that balance right? So we'd love to hear from you, and consultation closes at the end of February.
Thanks, Sharon, and I guess I endorse that. If you've got something to say about it, please put your thoughts in. So I am going to open for questions, and we've got one down the back here. So could you just perhaps give us your name, where you're from, and who the question's directed at? Thank you.
Gavin Austin, ABC Compliance. Just talking about the increase in levies. In the models that I've seen, it doesn't look as though there's going to be a major increase in government funding. And, you know, don't you think it's about time the government stepped up? I mean, I see the average increase at around 15%, and yet government's not even proposing to do that. And government hasn't even increased their contribution by the rate of inflation, albeit that inflation's pretty low. What are your thoughts on the chances of a spread of costs across the whole of New Zealand by government funding, and not just putting it all on the advisor?
That is a great question. I probably actually should have covered that off. So currently the split between Crown funding and levy funding is 25% Crown funding, 75% levy funding, and that's recognising like there are wider public benefits in having a well-resourced regulator and a well-regulated financial sector. There's also benefits to the industry of operating in that environment. We are actually, one of the questions we're asking in the consultation is what should that split be? How much of the increase should be funded by the Crown versus how much should be funded by levy payers? So if you've got views on that, please submit them. We, in the annex to the consultation paper where we set out potential levies, we assumed when we drew up that annex that there would be no increase in Crown funding. That's not because there won't be an increase in Crown funding. That's because we wanted to consult on the worst case scenario so that you'd be seeing what is the worst possible situation depending on what the balance ends up being so that you can provide that feedback on how that would impact your businesses. But actually, we do want to hear how much the Crown should be contributing, and there is a possibility of Crown contribution.
Maybe I can add to that, and perhaps in a more general sense. As I was listening to you, I was reflecting that just recently I had to write a cheque out for my two boys, high school, free public education, and I felt a bit grumpy. And then I was reflecting, well, of course, many consumers probably feel a little bit grumpy when they have to write a cheque out to pay for advice, and then you could argue that and sometimes advisors feel a little bit grumpy having to write a cheque out to pay for fees and levies to fund a regulator. So I think it's only natural we all feel a little bit grumpy about these things. But I suppose we have to take a step back sometimes and think about it in sort of the bigger picture. What is it that we actually want? And what do you want as a sector? What do you want for New Zealand Inc? And take that sort of bigger picture, step back and have a think about it. You'll see in the funding that there was a PwC review which spoke about how the FMA was a high-performing organisation. Of course, I would make that comment, but in reality, that's the thing. You've got to look at it and say, what is it that you want? What do you want from a regulator? What do you want for the sector? And sort of play that together. And that's what the consultation is all about.
Thank you. We've got a question down here.
Kia ora, this is Rio. I met you the last time at the KiwiSaver one. Just in regards to the trust and conduct reform code and the authorities in this new bill, the disclosure, as myself being a consumer of oil regulators, my question was asked when I claimed the other day around what happens to my information and who shares it and what authorization they share it with in regard to some of the questions that were asked in the claim, and is that data shared with unauthorised, or are they under the new regime? Are they protected under that sharing of data? Because that's a big thing today. It's a lot of data sharing going on, and there's a lot of data brokering, which us consumers are concerned about how much information is available. And that's part of this process. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Maybe I'll take that. I agree with you, and the Code Working Group agrees with you on that point. We shrunk the number of operational standards in the code from the old code down from, I think, about 13 to 5, but one of those 5 absolutely is about the protection of client information, because we thought there is no ways we can run a code without making that a central focus of the advisor. So have a look at the code and see how we've written it up there. Of course, that's backed up by privacy legislation as well. We consulted with the Office of the Privacy Commissioner to make sure that what we've said in the code is consistent with privacy legislation, but we regard it as highly important as well. The code applies in advice situations. It doesn't apply more broadly than that, but at least it has that protection in financial advice situations.
Down here to your left, Trisha.
Okay.
Hi, John Ryman from Elite Financial Services. This question's primarily focused at Dale because it refers to the code. It was mentioned by an earlier speaker that there are 400,000 Kiwis in conservative funds. And the problem with the previous regime was that people could not get advice easily because of less than 2,000 qualified people. I've gone through the new code. I'm trying to establish how we can improve that situation within the code without every advisor having to go right through the old standard of full investment planning. In section 8 of the code, it refers to being qualified under level 5, and if you want to advise on movement of funds or joining or leaving a fund, the relevant strand. Do you know of any providers, or is there any plan to develop a relevant strand can be added to the level 5 certificate without having to go through the investment planning process to achieve the outcome you're trying to achieve of getting more advice to more Kiwis about their KiwiSavers?
Thank you very much. That's an issue that we considered at length, and there are two parts to the answer. The first part is that the legislation requires the code to set minimum standards, and in the context of this question, minimum standards of competence. So the standards that we talk about in the code are a certificate level standard. So that is significantly below the standard required for a university degree. It is a baseline comprehension of the subject matter. And we are really concerned in protecting consumers to make sure that that minimum standard is, whilst the minimum, at least sufficient. That is, if you like, the background to the second part of the question, which is when giving KiwiSaver advice, KiwiSaver doesn't stand in isolation from the rest of a person's financial situation, and in particular, their other investment needs. We believe, as the Code Working Group, that in order to give competent KiwiSaver advice, you need to be able to consider the other investment possibilities of a client. And we think having at least some awareness of what those other possibilities are is absolutely paramount. Now, that answer starts to get weaker if the competence minimum goes up and up and up. So if we had a situation where the investment learning that you would require to do was getting more and more comprehensive, I concede that that second part of the answer would need to be reflected on more deeply. But given that we've got this quite baseline minimum standard, we thought it was appropriate that everybody in giving KiwiSaver advice should easily be able to meet the requirements of that part of the Level 5 certificate. Thank you.
Angus, I guess while we're talking about the code, and I know that Katrina and Andrew are going to unpick the code this afternoon and do a very good job in their masterclass, I guess, have you got any sort of hints for people thinking about the code, and we're talking about customer-centric, any hints that you could be giving to people out here? Because, I mean, I think one of the things that came out of the masterclass yesterday was around the competency, how do I put that practically into my business? So. Yes. Interested in that.
Yes, so the legislation makes the code split into two parts. There's one part that you sort of have to have before you start giving advice, and there's another part that governs what you do whilst giving advice. And we deal with it the other way around. We deal with what you're doing while you're giving advice in the front part of the code, and at the end we deal with your sort of prerequisite competence. So in terms of the first part of the code, what you're doing in terms of interacting with your client. As I said earlier, that's all about being consumer-centric, and in the masterclass we can explore that in a bit more detail. It's focusing on what is important to the customer, how does the customer understand all the technical things that you're there as an advisor to navigate the the client through. At the back end of the code, this prerequisite of what you need to have before you give the advice. As I said earlier, the competence standards are minimums. Well, all the standards are minimum standards, but in particular for answering this, the competence standards are minimum standards. They're designed to give you sufficient threshold knowledge in order to speak authoritatively as an advisor. And I think I should make 2 points. Firstly, in comparison to the existing code, we have tried to really emphasize this theme of equivalence. So instead of saying this is the only thing you can do to qualify. We have set a benchmark, and we've made different pathways available to get to that benchmark as long as you can show equivalence. Now, we've obviously not made it too easy to show equivalence because we want to maintain a standard, but we've tried to give flexibility for different pathways. So that's the first point. The second point is actually what we would really like to see happen across industry, and I think it is starting to happen. I'm going to ask for a show of hands in a second like I did in Wellington yesterday. What we'd like to see happening is a move away from the focus on the qualification you need to get before you become an advisor to a focus on continuing professional development. We think you're the best people to decide what you need to do in terms of keeping your skills up and being able to do your particular type of work in your particular specialist field. And we really want to see more rigor around the attention people are paying to their CPD. I don't particularly want to be up here talking about level 5 and minimum standards. I want to be talking about whether the code is adequately equipped to help encourage you engage with CPD or not. So the show of hands that I asked for yesterday, and I'll ask for now, please could you put up your hand if you are still having problems or you know anybody else who's still having problems with the level 5 threshold of the initial qualification. Yep, that's 2 hands fewer than we had in Wellington. Two hands went up in Wellington yesterday. And one of those hands, I don't actually know about the second person, but one of those hands was a robo-advice question about how do you apply competence in a robo-advice sense, which I would be happy to go into if anybody wanted to. Thank you.
Angus, I'm going to ask you one more question, then I am going to go to the rest of the panel, because it has been raised on a few occasions. And the Minister talked yesterday about no more announcements. So I guess the audience would be interested to know about the code and any thoughts around review of the code, etc.
Yes, there was a question from the floor on this yesterday, and the questioner specifically referred to one of the competence standards, where we point out that for investment planning competence, the standard is an interim standard. So let me answer the question generally, but also specifically to that point. Generally, basically, as you've alluded to, Trisha, the theme for all contributors to this regime is to give it a good bedding in period. There's a transitional period ahead of us, giving people the opportunity to settle in to the new regime and go through transition is the focus for all of us. And I think I speak on behalf of MB and FMA there. I don't think anybody is eager to have early changes. However, I need to reserve a position there, and that is the legislation specifically puts the code outside the legislation so that through consultation it can change to deal with circumstances over time. And if something arises in the short term that gives us cause for acting sooner, then of course we need to think about it. But our strong intention is not to throw more change at people. Our strong intention, as I say, is to allow a good bedding in period. Don't push me for time. You say this date or that date. It obviously depends on the circumstances. I'll be quick, Trisha. In terms of the specific answer, the reason we put that placeholder in for investment planning is because we got such divergent feedback on what competence people require for financial planning. Some people said, don't go any higher than we are at the moment, that's fine. A lot of other people said, at a minimum, it should be a university degree. We all know what's happening in Australia. They're going through all of their FASIA deliberations about the standards there. That's obviously relevant to us as well. Yes, we will revisit that space, but the overriding point that I've just made in terms of allowing for a bedding in period, those apply here as well, but that is a standard that we will definitely come back to at some stage.
Thanks, Angus. Now, I'd quickly like to get on, because I see we're going for time. Derek and Katrina, this is really aimed at you. Licensing. So I guess we're all keen to know how's it going. I know you've got your licensing team here with the storeholders as well, but kind of where are we at? And Katrina, what you're seeing through your hotline as well. So Derek, if you'd like to.
Yeah, look, I think things are really very encouraging. Already there's 200 odd advice businesses who have made the decision and successfully navigated through the licensing regime and have come out the other end. And that's really good news. But even behind that, there are hundreds and hundreds of advice businesses who have clearly also made the decision and are about to start on that journey as well. So I think that's a good thing. So what we're seeing is the pipeline is growing. So one of the questions I get asked a lot is, well, how long does it take once I submit my application to hear back? And the answer is, well, it depends, and it depends on the nature of the application and the complexity of the application. But it could take anything from up to 60 days. So as you can see, as that pipeline continues to grow as it is, and growing significantly, you can see that time is going to become more constrained. So really the encouragement today is to take that decision and don't delay and get your application in, because the momentum is building and it's very, very encouraging to see. The licensing team have told me that there's one tip that I can pass on to you today, is that there's been a few advisors applying for a licence in their own name, and they've indicated that they're going to have nominated representatives. So that's obviously resulted in some sort of contact with the applicant, and inevitably the answer is, oops, I didn't mean to tick that, or that was a mistake. So all that does, of course, is slow the process down for you and for us. So really my encouragement is just to take your time and think about what it is you're doing when you're filling in those applications. Make sure that you're mindful about the boxes you're ticking and you thought it through. So that's probably from my perspective, but very, very encouraging, Trisha.
And Katrina, what are you hearing through your hotline?
Well, there's two things we're really hearing. The first one is around how do I start? Do I go onto the FMA site, or do I go into Competence office? Do I need a Real Me account? So some basic things you need to go into entry to be able to go through the process. My company isn't registered at the moment. Do I have to register my company to be able to go through the process? So what we say to people is get a cup of tea and go really slowly. And I know the FMA are working on making it easier to navigate your way through the very beginning of the process, because sometimes it's a little bit hard to find where to actually start the process. So we get a lot of questions around that. And the second question we get, which is really popular, is I'm thinking of retiring in the next couple of years. I've got a mortgage business down in my shingle out in Gore. What should I do? Should I have my own FAP, or should I belong to somebody else's FAP? And we're getting that question a lot. So our response to that is, if you're not sure what you're going to do, this is transitional licensing, and they are transitional licenses. So obtain a transitional license and go from there. If you're unsure, it's better to obtain a transitional license than to have missed that window altogether, and then you can't give regulated financial advice. So go ahead and get a transitional license, because that's what transitional means. It's for a short period of time of 2 years, or before if you go to full licensing.
Might be then useful just to add that we have a frequently asked questions section on our website, and that's not a static FAQ, so we are constantly reviewing and monitoring that as we get questions in. We're updating that all the time so do use that, because it's something that we're actively promoting and using ourselves. But also we've got our options tool, which really brings together lots of disparate information across all the organisations together in one place, that enables advisors to much more easily navigate some of the issues and make some of the decisions. So there's lots of really good tools that are available, and certainly on the FMA website, and great work that Katrina and her team are doing through their hotline as well.
I think the really key message is, though, you can't do nothing. You can't sit back and get to the 29th of June and go, I haven't done anything. You have to make a decision before the 29th of June about how you're going to give regulated financial advice after that. So doing nothing is no option.
And so, Derek, that leads in nicely. Let's have a little 1 minute around full licensing, because I know that's something that people are talking about as well. So
yeah, that's right. A lot of people do ask about full licensing. So we're at the state where we are just completing the development of our thinking and testing our thinking, and so you can hear more from us about full licensing over the coming months. So we're getting very close. So here's what I can say. I mean, in reality, what you know already is quite extensive. You know what the legislation is, you know what your obligations are in law, you know what your obligations are through the code, And then in the transitional licence itself, there are a couple of transitional licence standards, and we've been fairly open about saying that they're likely to follow through into full licensing. So the reality is, you know what all the obligations are to be a compliant business, and everybody right now is obviously very focused on thinking about what these obligations are. How do we demonstrate, not just tell, but actually can show and evidence that we're meeting these obligations? And that, I think, is a critical point in terms of thinking about full licensing, is just making sure that you are meeting all of your obligations and you can demonstrate it, and then you're a long way to where you need to be.
Great. We've got 30 seconds left, so David Bishop, I'm sorry, I'm going to ask each panellist for 30 seconds, what are we going to look like when we're standing here in a year, 18 months' time? Katrina, I'll start with you.
Oh, we're going to look excited, positive, motivated. We're going to look like we're professional businesses with advice which people can trust and have confidence in. And I think we're going to have a sector which is going to grow and make New Zealanders' financial health, wealth increase significantly.
Thank you. Angus.
I think just the financial services sector, particularly advice that holds the customer, is central, and with good conduct being the norm.
Yes.
And I think just building on that, like we've so far really avoided that kind of crisis of confidence that we've seen in Australia, and I think we're getting ahead of that crisis in confidence happening here. So I'm really positive about the wider financial services sector, putting the customer at the centre, and that just increasing confidence across the board.
Yeah, I think just following my sort of theme of encouragement this morning, I think be proud and have pride in who you are and what you do, because you have a lot of good reasons to do so. And I think that there's a lot of good work and a lot of hard work that's been going into advice businesses right now, as people are thinking about their strategies. They're thinking about, how am I going to operate in the new regime? How am I going to structure myself? In 12 months' time, we'll start to see all of this good work and hard work actually come in and bear fruit. And so I think from a consumer point of view, 12 months from now, they're going to walk into advice offices right across the country and have stunning client experiences because of all the good work that you're doing right now.
Great, thank you. And I think, look, it feels like we've just got on the cusp of everything. We could be going for another few hours. So can I encourage you then to go and see the stallholders that are out there, because I know that Derek's team are out there, Sharon's team are out there as well. So look, thank you very much, everybody. As I said right at the start, congratulations. You are the ones that are going to make this industry a profession. Thank you.